There's a freezer sitting in a garage right now that everybody in that house has already agreed is dead. Nobody's argued about it. Nobody's checked anything twice. The food went soft. Somebody opened the door, felt warm air where cold air should have been, and said the only sentence that ever gets said in that situation. Yeah, the compressor's gone. And honestly, that's not a dumb thing to say. That's the reasonable thing to say. If you'd walked in and felt that same warm air, you'd have said it too. I would have said it too. In fact, I did say it, more or less word for word, the first time I stood in front of one of these things. Here's the part that should have stopped everybody, though. The freezer was still running, not humming faintly, not making some sad, dying noise. Running. You could hear the motor doing its thing on the back of the unit, same as it probably had for the last 15 years. The compressor is the part everybody thinks is responsible for making the freezer cold. If it's running and the freezer's warm, something about that sentence, "the compressor's gone," stops making sense. That's usually where people stop looking, though. Not because they're careless, because the compressor is the part everybody knows. It's big, it's expensive, it sits there looking important, and somewhere along the way we all decided that if a fridge or a freezer dies, that's the part responsible. It's basically the celebrity of the whole appliance. Gets blamed for everything, mostly because it's the only name anyone recognizes. So that's where the story usually ends. Compressor's shot, appliance's junk, haul it to the curb, buy a new one. Except this time, I actually opened the thing up and looked inside, and what I found didn't line up with the story I'd already decided to believe. Ice. An unreasonable, almost comical amount of ice. Not a light frost you'd expect on the walls of an old freezer. We're talking a solid white block built up around the back panel, thick enough that it looked like something out of an ice fishing shack. How does a machine that's failing to freeze anything manage to build that much ice on the inside? That question sat with me longer than I expected it to. Too warm to keep food frozen. Too frozen to make any sense as too warm. One of those had to be wrong, or I was missing something about how the thing actually worked. Turns out I was missing something I genuinely didn't know existed until I went looking. And I'd been around appliances plenty by that point. Most people never think about the fact that a frost-free freezer has to heat itself on purpose. Not constantly, not to warm your food, just enough, on a schedule, to melt the frost that naturally builds up around the coils in the back. That's the whole trick behind why some freezers never need manual defrosting and others turn into a glacier if you don't stay on top of it. There's a small heater tucked back there, along with whatever controls that specific model uses to time it, and its entire job is to periodically clear that ice before it becomes a problem. That's when it clicked for me. The freezer wasn't just supposed to stay cold. It was supposed to periodically melt the frost building up behind the scenes, quietly, in the background, without the owner ever knowing it happened. And here's the part that would trick even somebody who actually knows refrigeration. The compressor can keep running perfectly for years while a completely different problem, frost building up around the evaporator, quietly chokes off the airflow that's supposed to carry cold air into the freezer. There's a fan back there whose only job is to push that air out into the box. Two systems, working side by side. One of them can fail completely while the other has no idea anything's wrong, which means somewhere in that garage freezer, a system smaller than a phone charger had been doing invisible maintenance work for over a decade, and when it stopped, for whatever reason, nobody noticed right away because the compressor kept running like nothing was wrong. The ice just kept building. Until it wasn't a thin layer anymore, it was a wall, thick enough to block airflow around the coils entirely. That's the part that actually explains everything. Heavy frost buildup can block the vents and coils that are supposed to circulate cold air through the unit. So the compressor's out there working exactly like it's supposed to, and none of that cold air can get where it needs to go because there's a literal ice dam in the way. From the outside, from the front of the freezer, from where anybody's standing when they open the door and feel warm air, that looks identical to a dead compressor. Sounds like one. Feels like one. It is not one. I want to be careful here because it'd be easy to walk away from this thinking every dead freezer is secretly a defrost problem in disguise. And that's not true. Sometimes the compressor really is done. This isn't a universal diagnosis. It's one very specific, very sneaky failure pattern that happens to exist in a lot of frost-free models, and it happens to be almost perfectly disguised as something much more expensive and much more final. That's really the whole story, if you think about it. The freezer wasn't lying to anybody. It wasn't broken in some dramatic, obvious way. A tiny hidden system tucked behind a panel nobody ever looks at quietly stopped doing its job, and the visible result of that looked exactly like a total failure of the entire machine. There's one more piece worth knowing, mostly because it proves the pattern isn't a fluke. Compressors also depend on a small start relay just to get moving in the first place, a part you could lose in a junk drawer. When that fails, the compressor won't start either, and from the outside, it looks exactly the same as a dead one. Different part, same disguise. Here's the thing, though. The compressor was never actually the valuable part of that freezer. Not once it was already running. Not once it was already innocent. The valuable part was knowing which small, forgotten system had actually failed. Because that's the one piece of information that decides whether a machine is garbage or 20 minutes from working again. Anybody can replace a compressor. It costs real money, and it means giving up before you've actually found the problem. Understanding what's really going on back there is worth more than the compressor ever was, because it's the only thing standing between this is trash and this still works. That's a strange thing to sit with, honestly. The idea that the most valuable part of a broken machine might not be a part at all. It might just be the 5 minutes somebody spends actually looking instead of guessing. The compressor sits there weighing 20-30 pounds, looking like the obvious center of the whole machine. And it was never the thing that mattered here. What mattered was small enough to hide behind a plastic panel most owners never even know exists. I keep coming back to the person who first called that freezer dead because I don't think they did anything wrong. The food thawed. The freezer's old. Appliance repair gets expensive fast, and nobody wants to gamble money on guesswork. Given exactly what they saw and felt, the compressor's gone was the only reasonable conclusion available. I'd have landed in the same place. Most people would. What changes the story isn't that the diagnosis was stupid. It's that the diagnosis was made before anyone actually looked. And once you look, once you see the ice, once you realize there's a whole heating and timing system back there whose only job is to prevent exactly this, the obvious explanation starts to feel less like an explanation and more like a guess that happened to sound confident. For the record, nobody should be poking around energized electrical components trying to sort this out themselves. If you're getting into the guts of a defrost system or anything wired into the back of one of these units, that's disconnected power, qualified person territory, not a weekend project with a butter knife. But that's not really what stuck with me anyway. What stuck with me was standing in front of that freezer afterward, looking at the exact same object I'd looked at an hour earlier and seeing something completely different. It hadn't changed. I had. An hour before, it was scrap. Now it was a machine with one small, quietly forgotten part that had let a mountain of ice grow where it shouldn't have, and that one piece of understanding was worth more than any part you could actually hold in your hand. And it's not just freezers. The lawnmower that just needs a new engine is sometimes a $2 spark plug. The truck somebody's ready to junk over a check engine light is sometimes a sensor smaller than a thumb. Same pattern, different machine, same expensive part getting blamed for a cheap parts mistake. That freezer's still around, by the way, back in service, humming in the corner like nothing happened. Nobody talks about the near miss anymore. To them, it's just a freezer again. But for a few days, it was a machine that had already been sentenced, sitting there running the whole time, waiting for somebody to notice the contradiction instead of the conclusion. The compressor never was the valuable part. It never had to be. The valuable part was the willingness to ask one more question before writing the whole thing off.